The sound of the drill was not just a mechanical noise. It was a scream. It was a piercing, metallic shriek that tore through the heavy oak timber of my front door and vibrated directly into my bones. I sat in my wingback chair in the hallway, a mere 10 feet away from the intrusion, watching the wood splinter. It was barely 6 in the morning. Outside, the Seattle mist was likely still clinging to the pavement, chilling the world to the bone. But inside, my blood was boiling with a heat I hadn't felt in decades. "Open up, Eleanor." The voice belonged to Serena. It was sharp, entitled, and lacking any semblance of the respect one should have for the woman who had housed her for nearly a year. "This house is Julian's property, and we have every right to enter." I didn't move. I didn't tremble. My hands were folded calmly in my lap, resting on the soft fabric of my robe. Next to me, on the small telephone table, sat my preparation. It wasn't a weapon. Not in the traditional sense, but it was going to be far more effective than any gun or knife. "Ma'am," a male voice grumbled from the other side, muffled by the thick wood. "This lock is a deadbolt. Grade 1 heavy duty. It's going to take a minute to drill the core out." "Just do it!" Serena shrieked, her voice cracking with hysteria. "Break it down if you have to. That old witch changed the locks on us. She threw us out like garbage." I closed my eyes for a brief second, letting the insults wash over me. Old witch. That was new. Yesterday, it had been a bitter hag. The day before that, a selfish hoarder. They were just words. Desperate arrows fired by a woman who realized her free ride had finally come to a sudden, jarring halt. But the drill was real. They were physically breaking into the sanctuary I had built, with 40 years of double shifts at the hospital, 40 years of cleaning bedpans, comforting the dying, and saving every single penny so I wouldn't have to rely on anyone when I got old. I looked at the mixture in the bucket beside me. I had spent the night preparing it. It wasn't just ketchup. That would have been too thin, too orange. I had mixed 4 large bottles of the cheapest tomato concentrate with corn syrup and a touch of chocolate syrup to darken it, to give it that Venus, deoxygenated look of arterial spray. It was thick, viscous, and terrifyingly realistic in the dim light of the foyer. The drill bit punched through. A small shower of sawdust exploded onto my pristine hardwood floor. That was my cue. I stood up, my knees popping slightly, a reminder of my 65 years. I picked up the bucket. With the precision of a surgeon, I began to splash the concoction. I didn't just dump it. I staged it. I cast a wide arc across the bottom of the door, letting it pool in the gaps of the floorboards. I dipped my old gardening rags into the sludge and scattered them as if they had been used to staunch a wound. Then, I took the most important step. I scooped a handful of the cold, sticky mess and smeared it down the front of my white nightgown. I covered my hands, my arms, and even dabbed a streak across my cheek. The smell of tomatoes and sugar was overpowering to me. But to anyone entering from the fresh air, the visual shock would override the olfactory senses. "Almost there!" Serena yelled. "I can hear it giving way." I dropped the bucket in the corner, out of immediate sight, and collapsed onto the floor amidst the red carnage. I sprawled out, one hand reaching toward the door, the other clutching my chest. I wasn't just Eleanor Vance, the retired nurse anymore. I was a victim of a violent break-in. The lock clicked. The deadbolt retracted with a heavy thud. "Kick it," Serena commanded. The door flew open, banging against the wall with a violence that shook the picture frames. 2 men in blue coveralls stumbled in, followed by Serena, who was already marching forward with her finger pointed, ready to scream another accusation, but the scream died in her throat. For a moment, time simply stopped. The silence that descended on the entryway was heavier than the door itself. Serena's eyes bulged, her jaw unhinged. She looked at the floor, at the dark red pool expanding toward her expensive leather boots, and then at me, lying prone in the center of it, covered in gore. One of the locksmiths dropped his drill, It hit the floor with a clatter that sounded like a gunshot in the quiet morning. "Oh my God," the man whispered, stumbling back and nearly knocking Serena over. "Oh my God. We killed her." Serena let out a sound that wasn't human. It was a high-pitched, strangulated squeak that escalated rapidly into a full-blown shriek of terror. "Eleanor! Eleanor! What happened?" I didn't move. I kept my eyes fixed on the ceiling, breathing shallowly, letting my chest rise and fall just enough to show life, but not enough to show calm. "You did this!" the second locksmith yelled at Serena, backing away with his hands raised in surrender. "You said it was a domestic dispute. You said it was your house. You didn't say there was violence." "I didn't do anything!" Serena screamed, her face draining of all color. She was fine yesterday. The commotion had done its job. I heard the heavy footsteps of Mr. Abernathy from next door pounding up the porch steps. He was an early riser, a man who had seen combat in 2 different wars. And he didn't take kindly to noise before coffee. "What in the blazes is going on here?" Abernathy's voice boomed from the doorway. He stopped dead. He saw the red. He saw the men. He saw me. Without hesitation, Abernathy pulled his phone from his pocket. "I am calling the police. Nobody move. And you!" He pointed a finger like a weapon at Serena. "You stay right there." Serena was hyperventilating now. She looked at the red fluid on the floor, terrified to touch it, terrified to step in it. She looked at me, and for a split second, I saw the gears turning in her head. She was wondering if I was actually hurt, or if this was a trick, but the sheer volume of the blood was too convincing. Fear won out over suspicion. "I didn't touch her. I swear. We just opened the door," I groaned. It was a low, painful sound. I pushed myself up slowly, my red-stained hand slipping on the floorboards. "You broke in," I rasped. My voice was weak, trembling. "I told you not to come back." The younger locksmith looked like he was about to vomit. "Lady, please, don't move. The ambulance is coming. We didn't know. She told us she had the deed." I dragged myself until my back was against the wall, sitting amidst the chaos like the survivor of a massacre. I looked straight at Serena. Her arrogance was gone. Her entitlement had evaporated. All that was left was a frightened child who had pushed too far. "Get out," I whispered. The police sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder by the second. 2 cruisers screeched to a halt in front of the house, their lights flashing blue and red against the gray morning mist. When the officers rushed in, guns drawn, 2 men with breaking and entering tools, a hysterical woman screaming about property rights, and an elderly woman covered in red on the floor. "Drop the tools!" the lead officer shouted. It took 20 minutes to sort out the immediate panic. The paramedics arrived and rushed to me. I waved them off calmly as I stood up. "I'm not injured," I said, my voice suddenly returning to its normal steel-edged tone. "It's tomato paste and corn syrup." The paramedic paused, his hand halfway to his bag. "Excuse me?" I looked at the officer, then at Serena, whose face went from pale white to a furious, beetroot red. I said, "I am not injured. I used what I had to defend my home. These people were breaking in with a drill. I am a 65-year-old woman living alone. I had to make them stop, and I knew asking wouldn't work." The police officer, a tall sergeant with a weary face, looked at the door with the drilled-out lock, then at the red mess, and finally at Serena. "Ma'am," he said to me, "are you saying you staged this?" "I am saying I created a visual deterrent for intruders who were forcibly entering my property," I replied calmly, wiping a glob of sticky syrup from my arm. "And it worked. They stopped, didn't they?" Serena lunged forward. "She's crazy. You see? She's absolutely insane. Arrest her. She wasted police resources." The sergeant turned to Serena, his expression hardening. "Ma'am, Did you or did you not hire these men to drill out the lock of a home you do not own? It's my husband's house, Serena yelled. I walked over to the hallway table, avoiding the puddles I had made, and picked up a file folder I had prepared the night before. I handed it to the sergeant. This is the deed to the house, I said. My name is the only one on it. Eleanor Vance. Not Julian Vance. Not Serena Vance. Just me. I paid the mortgage off 6 years ago. Here is the eviction notice I verbally gave them 3 days ago. And here is the text message I sent yesterday, stating that if they returned, I would call the authorities. The sergeant reviewed the papers. He looked at the locksmiths. Do you have a work order signed by the owner of the property? The locksmiths shook their heads vigorously. She said she lost her keys. She said her mother-in-law had dementia and locked her out. Serena was trembling. But now it was with rage. Julian lived here his whole life. We have rights, squatters' rights. You were guests, I said coldly. Guests who overstayed their welcome by 8 months. Guests who refused to contribute a dime to the utilities. Guests who insulted me in my own kitchen. And guests don't drill holes in the front door at 6 in the morning. The sergeant handed the papers back to me. He turned to Serena. Ma'am, this is a civil matter regarding the eviction. But breaking and entering is a criminal one. Since the owner was inside and you used force to enter, we are dangerously close to a home invasion charge. Serena gasped. Home invasion? I live here. Not anymore, the sergeant said. The owner has revoked your permission. You need to leave. Now, if you want to retrieve belongings, you can call the station and request a police escort at a later time. But right now, you are trespassing. Serena looked around for support. The locksmiths were already packing up, eager to disappear. The neighbors were watching from their porches. Mr. Abernathy was standing by the hedge with his arms crossed, nodding at the police. Where is Julian? I asked. Serena sneered. He's at the hotel. He couldn't bear to watch you be so cruel to us. He's sick with stress because of you. Coward, I thought. My son, the coward. Take your drill and get off my porch. Serena stood there for one last moment. She looked at the red stain on the floor, then at my face. You're going to pay for this, Eleanor. You're going to die alone in this big, empty house. Julian will never forgive you. I looked her dead in the eye. If forgiveness means letting you rob me of my peace, then I don't want it. Goodbye, Serena. The police escorted her to her car. I watched until the taillights disappeared down the foggy street. Then, I closed the door. I couldn't lock it. The core was destroyed. But I shoved a heavy chair under the handle. Only then did my legs give out. I slid down the wall, back into the sticky red mess, and I wept. I didn't cry because I was scared. I cried because I had won. And winning against your own family feels exactly like losing. The cleanup took hours. I scrubbed the hardwood on my hands and knees until the water in the bucket turned pink, then clear. I opened the windows to let the cold Seattle air blow out the smell of sugar and metallic tomato. By noon, the house was silent. It was the silence I had craved for 8 months. No loud television. No Serena complaining about the lack of closet space. No Julian tiptoeing around, avoiding my gaze because he knew he was failing me. I made a cup of tea and sat at my kitchen table. I needed to check my finances. The locksmith would cost money to fix. I needed to see if I had enough in the emergency fund. I opened my laptop and logged into my bank account. I usually only checked it once a month when my pension came in, but today felt like a day for diligence. When the page loaded, I frowned. The balance on my checking account was fine, but there was a notification on the sidebar. A credit line. I didn't have a credit line. I had never believed in debt. If I couldn't pay cash, I didn't buy it. That was the rule that had allowed me to buy this house. I clicked on the notification. Home equity line of credit. Active since February. Balance owed. $15,400. My teacup clattered onto the saucer. $15,000. I clicked on the transaction history. It was a roadmap of Serena's desires and Julian's weakness. A designer handbag store, a high-end furniture boutique, a weekend at a resort in Napa Valley, a jewelry store. They hadn't just been living off my food and electricity. They had been eating my house, my equity, the security I had broken my back to build. My hand trembled as I reached for the phone. I dialed the bank. I needed to be sure. Maybe it was a mistake. Mrs. Vance, the teller said after a long verification process. The paperwork was signed electronically. The IP address matches the one you are calling from now. It was authorized 3 months ago. My son. He knew my passwords. He knew my social security number. He had set this up while I was sleeping upstairs, probably sitting right here at this table, clicking away my future to buy his wife a pair of diamond earrings. I hung up the phone. The sadness that had been weighing on me all morning evaporated. It was replaced by a cold, hard stone in the center of my chest. I didn't call Julian. I didn't text him. I went to the police station. The desk sergeant knew me from the morning's incident. When I showed him the bank statements, his face fell. Mrs. Vance, this is identity theft and fraud. Since the amount is over $10,000, it's a felony. If you file this report, the district attorney will likely pick it up. Your son could go to prison. I looked at the young officer. He was about Julian's age, but he had a firmness in his jaw that my son had never possessed. My son is already in a prison, I said softly. A prison of his own weakness. If I don't do this, he will never get out. I signed the papers. The pen scratched loudly in the quiet station. With every stroke of my signature, I felt like I was cutting the umbilical cord that I should have severed 20 years ago. 3 days passed. The house remained quiet. I hired a reputable locksmith to replace the front door mechanism with a keypad and a reinforcement plate. I spent my days gardening, aggressively pruning the hydrangeas, cutting away the dead wood so the new blooms could survive. On the 4th evening, the doorbell rang. I checked the camera I had installed. It was Julian. He looked terrible. His designer jacket was wrinkled. He hadn't shaved. He looked like a man who had been running a marathon in muddy water. I opened the door, but I didn't step back to let him in. I stood in the threshold, a guardian of my own gate. Mom. Hello? Julian. He looked at me, his eyes swimming with tears. The police came to the hotel. They arrested me. I spent the night in a cell. Serena posted bail with her dad's money, but... Mom, they're talking about felonies. I know, I said. I filed the report. He flinched as if I had slapped him. You? But I'm your son. That is the only reason I'm even talking to you right now, I replied. You stole $15,000 from me, Julian. You stole it to buy purses and vacations while I was cooking your dinner and doing your laundry. Serena made me do it, he blurted out. I stepped out onto the porch and closed the door behind me. I didn't want him inside. The house was clean now. I didn't want his excuses contaminating the air. Stop it, I snapped. But you are a 40-year-old man. You clicked the buttons. You signed the forms. You stole from your mother. You did that. Not her, he crumbled. He sat down on the top step of the porch and buried his face in his hands. He sobbed. A deep, ugly sound of a man who has finally run out of places to hide. She left me, he whispered. As soon as the charges were filed, she called her father. He posted the bail, and then she took the car and left. She said she couldn't be married to a criminal. I didn't feel satisfaction. I just felt a weary confirmation. Of course she did. So what now? I asked. I don't know, he wept. I lost my job 6 months ago, you know that. I have nowhere to go. Mom, please. Can I come home? I'll sleep in the basement. I'll do anything. I looked at him. My beautiful boy. The boy I had held when he had chickenpox. the boy I had cheered for at graduation. It would be so easy to say yes, to open the door, feed him soup, and tell him we would fix it together. That's what I had done his whole life. When he failed math, I hired tutors. When he wrecked his first car, I paid the deductible. When he got fired from his first architecture firm, I paid his rent for a year. And look where my help had gotten him. Sitting on a porch, facing a felony charge, unable to stand on his own 2 feet. No, I said. He looked up, shocked. What? You cannot come in. You cannot live here. But I have no money. I have nowhere to go. Then you will have to figure it out, I said, my voice trembling slightly but my resolve holding firm. There is a shelter downtown on 2nd Avenue. They take people in from 6 p.m. Mom. I have never been more serious, Julian. I love you too much to keep killing you with my kindness. I am pressing the charges. I am not dropping them. You are going to face the consequences of what you did. If you get probation, you will work to pay me back every single cent. If you go to prison, you will serve your time. But you are not coming back into this house until you are a man I can trust. He stared at me for a long time. He was waiting for me to crack. He was waiting for the smile, the hug, the, "It's okay." I didn't give it to him. Finally, he stood up. He wiped his nose on his sleeve. He looked smaller. Somehow, "You really hate me, don't you?" I sighed. A long exhale that carried the weight of 40 years. I love you enough to let you hate me, Julian. Because right now, you need to grow up more than you need a mother. He turned and walked down the steps. He didn't have a car. He started walking down the street, into the evening mist, toward the bus stop. I went back inside and locked the door. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the window, watching the street, my heart breaking with every beat. But I knew, with the certainty of a nurse who has to reset a broken bone, that the pain was necessary for the healing. The next 6 months were the hardest of my life. The court case proceeded. Julian pleaded guilty. Because it was a first offense, and he showed remorse, the judge was lenient. He received 5 years of probation, and was ordered to pay full restitution. I didn't see him. I heard through the grapevine, mostly from Mr. Abernathy, who had a way of finding things out, that Julian was living in a chaotic shared apartment in the industrial district. He was working 2 jobs, one as a night stalker at a grocery store, and another hauling scrap metal on weekends. Serena filed for divorce. She tried to sue him for alimony, but since he had 0 assets and a criminal record, she got nothing. I stayed in my house. I painted. I joined a book club. I healed. I paid off the credit line slowly from my savings, refusing to let the interest accumulate, waiting for Julian's restitution checks to start arriving. The first check arrived 4 months after the sentencing. It was for $200. It came with a note. Just a post-it note. "I'm sorry." I taped the check to my refrigerator. I didn't cash it immediately. I just looked at it. It was the first money Julian had ever given me. Month 5, another check. Month 6, $400. Then, on a rainy Tuesday in November, almost exactly a year after the incident with the drill, the doorbell rang. I checked the camera. It was Julian. He looked different. He had lost the soft, doughy look of a man who ate too many restaurant meals. He was leaner. His hands, resting at his sides, looked rougher. He was wearing a simple flannel shirt and jeans, not the designer suits he used to favor. I opened the door. "Hi, Mom." "Hi, Julian." He held up an envelope. "I wanted to bring this one in person. It's a bit more this month. I got promoted to shift manager at the warehouse." I took the envelope. He shuffled his feet. He didn't ask to come in. He just stood on the porch, respectful of the boundary I had drawn. "I saw Serena yesterday," he said quietly. "She was at the mall. She looked exactly the same. She pretended she didn't see me." Does that bother you? I asked. He thought about it. No. It made me realize something. I was drowning trying to keep her afloat. And I was drowning you to do it. I nodded. Yes. You were. I'm paying you back, Mom. Not just the money. I'm going to pay back the trust. I know it might take 10 years, but I'm going to do it. I looked at his hands. I saw a bandage on his thumb and a callus on his palm. Evidence of work. Evidence of life. Do you want a cup of coffee? I asked. His head snapped up. Surprise widening his eyes. Really? On the porch? I clarified. You're not quite ready for the living room yet. But it's cold out here. I'll bring out 2 mugs. He smiled. It was a small, tentative smile, but it was genuine. That sounds great, Mom. I went inside to pour the coffee. As I watched the steam rise from the mugs, I looked at the red front door. It wasn't scarred anymore. It was repainted, reinforced, and strong. I walked out onto the porch and handed a mug to my son. We sat on the swing bench, side by side, watching the rain fall on the street. We didn't talk about the past. We didn't talk about the drill, or the tomato sauce, or the police. We talked about his job. We talked about my garden. We talked about the future. It wasn't a perfect ending. He was still struggling, and I was still guarded. But as we sat there, 2 adults drinking coffee in the cold air, I realized that for the first time in his life, my son wasn't a child I needed to carry. He was a man sitting beside me, and that, I realized, was worth every ounce of the heartache it took to get here. Sometimes, you have to close the door to save the house, and sometimes, you have to let your children fall so they can finally learn that they have the strength to stand back up.